Welcome to the NT podcast, Science and Theology podcast, the best in the Balkans in this field. So today we have a great privilege of speaking with Dr. Gane, a renowned Old Testament scholar and a former student of the legendary Jacob Milgrom. Dr. Gane, welcome. How are you?
Thank you. Very good to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for coming. I'm really glad that you accepted this, and it's a privilege to talk on this topic because it's really hard, and we need someone who really study this deeply. So, Dr. Gane, for those who don't know, is the author of the NIVAC application commentary on Leviticus and Numbers, and one of the leading voices in biblical scholarship, especially when it comes to the priestly materials of the Pentateuch. So, in this episode, we will dive into a fascinating and often debated topic, the dating of Leviticus and Numbers. Are these books post-exilic compositions? What about the so-called P source and the Holiness Code age? So, Dr. Gane, my first question for you is, the book of Leviticus had a long period of growth before reaching its final form, according to most scholars, that took place during the Persian period. So that's 4th, 5th, or 6th century BCE. So when would you date the book of Leviticus, and what arguments would you provide for your position?
Okay, there are several aspects, several kinds of data to pursue. One of them is the construction of the sanctuary. And I have a colleague, a former student of ours here, who has written an interesting article in a volume that we're producing called Rethinking the Composition of the Pentateuch. His name is Scotty Baker, and he has written on the materials that were used in the Israelite sanctuary. Now, this, of course, is in the book of Exodus, but that is very much informing the book of Leviticus because Leviticus has the rituals that were used in that sanctuary. And that sanctuary is regarded as fictitious by many historical critics who regard the origin of these texts, so-called priestly source, to be in the Persian period. They regard Moses as not historical. The wilderness sanctuary is not historical. They do not accept the narrative framework in which these texts are set, because there's a narrative framework in Leviticus. There's very little narrative in Leviticus, but there's a little bit, just enough to tell you that it's placed in the wilderness, and it's after the construction of the sanctuary, when it's being inaugurated, dedicated, consecrated. And so they fit together. In fact, Exodus to Leviticus really are one book in the sense that Leviticus continues. The beginning of Leviticus starts off Vayikra, which means, and he called. And it doesn't say who called right there. And he called to Moses from the tent of meeting in Leviticus 1:1. And that is a continuation of the grammar of the end of Exodus, because the subject of that first verb in Leviticus is in Exodus chapter 40, the last chapter of Exodus. So they really continue together. So you have to take them together. All right, having said that, the materials of the sanctuary were investigated by Scotty Baker, who is specializing in Egypt. And he did his PhD dissertation on the materials of the Israelite sanctuary against their Egyptian background, because the Pentateuch, the books of Moses, or Exodus particularly, says that the Israelites came out of Egypt, right? So what he did was to look at the availability of the different kinds of materials that are listed in Exodus for the building of the Israelite sanctuary. These include metals, they include fabrics, they include wood, and things like that. And what he found was that all of these items were available and became available in the New Kingdom period, about the 18th dynasty of Egypt. And this is in the time that really fits from the chronology that's given. If you go to 1 Kings, it says that 480 years before Solomon started to build his temple, the Israelites left Egypt. So you take that back from the time of Solomon, who started to reign about 960 or so BC, and you take that back and you end up in just after the middle of the second millennium BC, like 1450s, around there. BC. And that is during the New Kingdom. That's during the 18th dynasty, exactly when all of the materials for the Israelite sanctuary were available at their greatest extent and known. Now, some of them were available before, some didn't become available until the New Kingdom, including the way of dyeing fabrics and stuff like that, if I'm remembering correctly. And then later, some of them were not used as much until you get centuries later, and a later writer writing in the Persian period simply would not have referred to those materials in that way. So you can think, okay, a later writer writing fiction, historical fiction about the past of ancient Israel, and how is he going to depict it? He's going to depict it with materials that he knows, that are in his framework, that he knows from Egypt. And it's going to convince his audience, because if he says something else, his audience will not be convinced that that's really from Egypt. But that doesn't match with the materials that were actually used in the Israelite sanctuary. So that's one really good argument for the early dating of the book of Leviticus connected with Exodus. Now, there are also linguistic models, for example, linguistic dating that's being incorporated by and developed by Avi Horvitz, who just died. He was a teacher of mine at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I studied inscriptions with him, and he was a pioneer in the area of linguistic dating of texts, starting with his PhD dissertation on Psalms, Bein Lashon LaLashon, between language and language, it's called. And then he wrote a book comparing the language of Ezekiel to the language of Leviticus, because Ezekiel is during the exile. Okay, so if Leviticus was post-exilic, then Ezekiel should be before Leviticus. Leviticus should be after Ezekiel, right? But he discovered that Leviticus has older language than Ezekiel. And now, some people have criticized him for circular reasoning, for making certain assumptions and then building his conclusions on those assumptions. However, the assumptions, when you look at his assumptions, they're really quite valid. They're really quite convincing and quite well accepted. I mean, for one thing, you can look at books that are accepted as pre-exilic books, accepted as early, like the books of Samuel, for example. And then you look at the language there, you compare it with language elsewhere, and you can sort of develop a framework of language. The way archaeologists have frameworks for dating different items based upon pottery. And language changes like pottery, so that once you get to a new period, usage of language is a bit the same. We know that from English. I'm sure it happens in your language as well. And so as language changes, now it's very tricky, because a later writer can use archaic language. They can use older language, particularly if they're intentionally doing this. And some people now are really arguing quite strenuously that, in fact, the Pentateuch was written with archaic language that was known by later writers. But I've written in a chapter in this book that we're publishing now called Rethinking the Composition of the Pentateuch, that we're wrapping up the editing. It's going to come out this next year from Hendrickson Publisher. The editors are Kenneth Berglund, myself, Gary Rensburg, and Rahel Wells. Gary Rensburg is a very prominent Jewish scholar. And I wrote an article in there, a chapter, in which I referred to some arguments by people like Horvitz and others that don't just have to do with particular lexemes, that is, particular words, like you would look up a word in the dictionary, right? But they have to do with the structure of the grammar, the morphology, the way words are put together. And in both of these areas, the lexicography as well as the way they're put together, the statistics are showing that these usages are showing up in books that are demonstrably early, and that the Pentateuchal books agree with that. And so it's quite clear that the Pentateuch is written in classical biblical Hebrew, which is pre-exilic. Okay. Now, in terms of how early pre-exilic, because there is quite clearly some updating of language. We have some glosses, which are little explanations. For example, when it says that Abraham came from, or Avram came from Ur of the Chaldees, or Kasdim. Now, the Kasdim, the Chaldeans were not around until the first millennium BC. So this is apparently a gloss, that is an explanation, telling the later reader that this is where this Ur is. And then there are other kinds of glosses. For example, in Genesis 12, it says, Va'az Akna'ani ba'aretz. Then the Canaanite was in the land. All right. And so this looks like it's after the Canaanites were no longer in the land, which would be a later period. But it's explaining that this is an earlier period when the Canaanites were there. So these kinds of explanations are giving you information that is indicating that it is earlier. We have the renaming of places like Luz becomes Bethel and so on and so forth, and those sorts of things. Language of the ritual system, the so-called cult, seems to change from pre-exilic to post-exilic. But there's another angle, and that is the Samaritan Pentateuch. And I wrote a chapter on the Samaritan Pentateuch in relation to the Hebrew Masoretic text in the Exploring the Composition of the Pentateuch, Volume 3. Okay, I should just mention, we have a project that was begun by two doctoral students of mine. The project really began with a conversation in my class in Ugaritic, where we noticed that in Ugaritic texts, some of the same things are going on that are going on in the biblical text of the Pentateuch, that critical scholars say, this is a sign of different authorship. But in the Ugaritic text, you have the same thing happening in a text that's, nobody says it's different authorship, it's just one author. Okay. And so my students got interested in this, studying the authorship of the Pentateuch. And so they started a project called Exploring the Composition of the Pentateuch. It started off as a discussion group. They got people in by Zoom from different places. And then we had a conference in 2016, another one in 2018, and then a couple more after that. One most recently was in 2022. We got held up by COVID, of course. And then there's going to be another one in 2025 here at Andrews University. These include scholars who are Jewish, including from Israel, and Catholic, especially mainly evangelical Protestants, and some Seventh-day Adventists like myself. Okay, so we have a real mix. We come from different faith traditions, obviously, but what we agree on is that we need to look for a new model of the composition of the Pentateuch, because we are just not convinced by the documentary hypothesis, according to which the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, or the Torah, was composed by 4 anonymous hypothetical sources, JEDP. Now, J is for the Yahwist, because it was started by Germans, this theory. And in German, J is pronounced Yah, right? Yahwist. Okay. And so Yahweh is the name of the deity, Israel's deity, Yahweh. Elohim means God in Hebrew. That's a title, God. Whereas Yahweh is his personal name, Elohim is a title. So that's E, Elohim, for Elohim. And then D is Deuteronomy, and then P is the priestly source. And this theory developed in Germany particularly, and then it was crystallized by Julius Wellhausen into the classic documentary hypothesis. And that has J, and E are relatively early. I mean, they're monarchic. It's long after the entrance of the Israelites into Canaan, but they're in the monarchic period. And then those are pre-exilic. Then Deuteronomy is supposed to have originated during the time perhaps of Manasseh, later into the monarchy. And this is the book of the law that was found by Hilkiah the high priest and read to Josiah. And then P is the priestly material, which isn't just all about the sanctuary. It also includes anything that's boring in the Pentateuch. That is to say, you've got analytic kinds of things like lists, even Genesis 1, the list of creation. And then you have the begats, the genealogies are attributed to the priestly source. And this is regarded as exilic or post-exilic, the latest of the sources. After that, was crystallized. Other scholars, like Jewish scholars like Yechezkel Kaufman, who was at the Hebrew University, he argued that it's not JEDP, it's JEPD, so that P is pre-exilic. My teacher Milgrom accepted that P is pre-exilic. None of this goes back to Moses. It's all these hypothetical sources. So, however, subsequently, then, a lot of scholars have been departing from that. In Europe, many scholars have gotten to the point that they just accept P or non-P. So they don't accept the differentiation between J, E, and D. It's just P, priestly or non-priestly. There's been refinement within P because the so-called holiness source, which produced Leviticus chapters 17 or 18 to 26, it's all about the holiness of the people of Israel and so on, and the priesthood. And this holiness so-called source is supposed to be part of P. And so scholars had thought that it was older than the rest of P. However, Israel Knoll from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem came along not too long ago, a few decades ago, and wrote a book, The Sanctuary of Silence, after his dissertation. And he demonstrated that H is likely after the rest of P. And he finds traces of what it looks like H language, holiness language, in various parts of the rest of P. So he thinks, and my teacher Jacob Milgrom agreed, that H was very likely the final redactor or editor of the Pentateuch as a whole, being a very recent source. So that is one thing. In the United States, and there's a lot of variety. Of course, some scholars just accept the old documentary hypothesis, but many scholars on the cutting edge have just been moving away from it. They have been looking at the final form of the text, and they've been looking for what it means and the structure of it and other things. Because it used to be that scholars thought if we just identify the composition, the author, the date of composition, then we know everything about it, and that's all we need to know. But now scholars are looking at rhetorical criticism, which is analysis of the rhetoric, the language of persuasion, and things like that, the various linguistic aspects, many other, and then theological themes has become a much bigger thing. So these are all different ways that scholars are looking at it, so that there's been a big, huge book produced called The Formation of the Pentateuch. It's a big, thick, expensive book that was put out recently. And there they point out right away in the introduction that there's just no consensus on the composition of the Pentateuch, which includes Leviticus. It's just all over the map, to the extent that scholars in different groups of thought have trouble even communicating with each other. And so it's a call for communication. That's why our Exploring the Composition of the Pentateuch project is seeking to help this situation by going back, ignoring the speculative presuppositions. One of the presuppositions is that God doesn't intervene in history. There are no miracles. There's anything that could not happen in our lives from what we see didn't exist. So it doesn't accept the authorship of a Moses who received messages from God and all the rest of it. Now, I love what Kenneth Kitchen said. Kenneth Kitchen said, I think it's in his book on the reliability of the Old Testament. And he said, if there were not a historical Moses, there would have had to be someone just like him. because the profile of the Pentateuch, the setting, everything, the setting fits the new kingdom of Egypt. When Egypt was at its strongest, it was a superpower. A group of runaway slaves are not going to make it out of Egypt. They're not going to survive in the wilderness. They're not going to be producing an amazing body of literature. There has to be something unusual going on. And so some are really admitting this. We have to have God intervening, and we need someone like Moses who's highly trained, where he would be trained in the Egyptian court. The profile perfectly matches the composition of the Pentateuch. Okay, so our project has had several conferences, and we have already come out with volume #1 from Eisenbrauns, and it's called Exploring the Composition of the Pentateuch. Volume 2 is in process, and there in volume 2, I have a chapter in which I respond to Joel Baden. Now, Joel Baden is one of the leading, he's quite a young scholar from Yale University, is one of the leading neo-documentarians. There are some others like Jeffrey Stackert from University of Chicago. Neo-documentarians, including also Joel Baden's teacher was my very good friend, an Orthodox Jewish teacher from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem by the name of Baruch Schwartz. He's really a pioneer in neo-documentarianism, which is going back to Wellhausen and seeking to establish this. But they're not wanting to do like the original documentarians did. This is where this JEDP thing started, from the names of God. They're saying, no, that doesn't work. What works is that you go and you look at a text and you see if there are narrative disjunctures, that is, points at which the narrative doesn't make sense. It seems to contradict itself. Okay, so you look for contradictions or duplications, a story that looks like it was originally one story that's now duplicated and separated into two stories, and things like that. So it's really the narrative kinds of elements that are betraying multiple authorship. Okay, so I wrote a chapter there in our ECP2, Exploring the Composition of the Pentateuch volume, which is going to be coming out soon again from Eisenbrauns. And I dialogued with Joel Baden and pointed out that I took inconsistencies that he pointed out from the introduction to a book he wrote on the composition of the Pentateuch. And I just took his examples and I looked at those to see, is this really a contradiction? Does this duplication really mean that it was a different source? And in every case that I could find, I demonstrated that exegetically, if you look at them more closely and look at all the data, all the evidence, you discover that not one of those things that he regarded as contradictions or problems is really a problem. They're apparent, but they're not really problems. Now, there are others that are maybe bigger. We have to deal with those. But many of these things that are regarded as problems are therefore support for the documentary hypothesis, and therefore support for the late dating of the Pentateuch by these documentary sources. Those arguments, in many cases, don't hold up to exegetical scrutiny. In the ECP3 volume, Exploring the Composition of the Pentateuch 3 volume, which is also done with editing, it's going to be out soon from Hendrickson. And I was getting to this, but I took a quite a long route around to get to it. I have a chapter there on the Samaritan Pentateuch. And that's very interesting because this is one of the very important witnesses to the text of the Pentateuch. We have several different witnesses to it that are early. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls, are the earliest in Hebrew, and they date back to the 2nd century BC with biblical texts of the Pentateuch. We have some Leviticus fragments and fragments of other Pentateuchal books and so on. So they're the oldest Hebrew manuscripts. Later on, in the Middle Ages, the earliest text that we have that is complete is the Masoretic text. Masoretic means traditional. So the Masoretes were the traditional Jewish scribes who, after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, they chose what they thought was the best text that had survived, because many of the texts were burned up in the temple when the temple was destroyed. So there was a lot of diversity among different kinds of texts in the Second Temple period when Jesus was around and the disciples. And so they chose what they thought was the best text, the most reliable, and then they copied that very, very, very carefully. So that the earliest of those texts that we have are from about the 900s AD. Okay, so they're 1,000 years later than the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, scholars had thought that when we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls in about 1947, scholars thought, oh, good, we're going to see all the problems and mistakes that the Masoretes introduced into the text. They were shocked to find that the Masoretic text is so close to the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are differences, quite a number of them, but very, very small. And the Masoretes were extremely careful and the Masoretic text that we've had for centuries now without the Dead Sea Scrolls is almost the same as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, another witness to the text that's early is the Septuagint, the early Greek translation. Now, we call it Septuagint, which sounds singular, but it's really Ralph's, who was an older editor of the Septuagint, called it Septuaginta, which means Septuagints. Its name Septuagint, sept, comes from the idea that there were 70 translators, according to the ancient letter of Aristeas, who were gathered by King Ptolemy in Alexandria, and they were put in different rooms to translate the books, and they all came out with translations that agreed. That's legend. It didn't really probably happen that way, but we call it Septuagint after the 70 alleged translators. Now, this translation goes back to as early as the 3rd century BC, okay, 200s BC. So it's really very early, and earlier in some respects than some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, there's another witness, which is the Samaritan Pentateuch. The Samaritans are a small group. Of course, they were around in Jesus' day. We remember the story of the Good Samaritan and the woman at the well who was Samaritan, and the Samaritans and the Jews didn't like each other. The Jews didn't regard them as real Israelites because they were mixed. When the northern 10 tribes were taken captive by the Assyrians, then they sent other people into northern Israel and mixed the population to destroy their identity. The Samaritans, however, got hold of the book of the law. They really had to, because, as you may remember in the Bible, it says that there were some wild animals that were hurting them and so on, and they realized they needed to live according to the law of the God of the land. So they got some help. They got some teaching from the Jewish people. So they're related to the Jewish people. They're mixed, but there are still Samaritans that live in Israel near Mount Gerizim, which they regard as their center at Shechem, which is where Jacob had been. That's where Jesus met the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. And they have the Samaritan Pentateuch. They never accepted the later books of the Bible. They only accepted the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. They didn't accept the prophets, or either the former prophets, which are the historical books, Judges, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and so on. They didn't accept the prophets, the later prophets, or the writings, just the Pentateuch. They copied it very carefully. They have old manuscripts that are several centuries old, not as old as probably they say they are, but we do have this text that was copied carefully for millennia. And looking at this text, we find some interesting things. And I did an article on that, a chapter on that, the Samaritan Pentateuch. Excuse me, I got a cough. I'm outside, as you can see. And so if I go like this, I may be brushing off a fly. If I cough occasionally, it's because there's a bit of pollen in the air, okay? And the Samaritan Pentateuch, I did a chapter on that in the Exploring the Composition of the Pentateuch, Volume 3. Now, what I was looking for was, how early is the Samaritan Pentateuch, and does it teach us anything about the composition of the Pentateuch? What I discovered is that in some ways it aligns with the Septuagint, and in some ways it is different from it. There are differences to the Masoretic text, mostly similar, mostly the same, but there are some differences. So I was looking not just at the major differences that scholars have found in the Samaritan Pentateuch, such as, for example, in the 10 Commandments. At the end of the 10 Commandments, there was an addition in the Samaritan Pentateuch that's pointing out that the worship center needs to be at Mount Gerizim. They did not accept Jerusalem as the worship center. They accepted Mount Gerizim because Jacob was there and so on. And even, I think, Abraham and offered sacrifices when he was there first in the land of Canaan. So they thought that's the authorized place of sacrifice. So they added some things here and there. And especially they took from later in the Pentateuch, they would take a few words or a passage from Deuteronomy, and they would put it in earlier where they thought that it was helpful. They didn't really invent a lot of new stuff, but it comes out as being interpretive to an extent. Scholars have been most interested in those, but I was looking for more subtle hints of which may be earlier. Okay, so I compared the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Septuagint, and the Masoretic text, with in the area of ritual, which is my specialty. I specialize in ancient Near Eastern ritual and law against their ancient Near Eastern backgrounds. That's my specialty. And so I was looking for indications in ritual texts where there are differences and which is likely to be earlier and which is likely to be later. And I discovered that in most cases, the Samaritan Pentateuch is likely to be later. We can tell this, you see, textual criticism, which is what this is textual. So we're not criticizing the text, but it's textual criticism is analyzing the actual manuscript evidence that we have. So it's called lower criticism. It's not the higher criticism, which is looking speculatively at other kinds of aspects, but we're looking at actual manuscripts, looking at actual differences between them and trying to figure out which one may come from which and which one may be earlier and what are the implications of the differences, okay? And there are some criteria by which we look at this and make decisions. One of them is which text is likely to be the one that a later writer would come along and want to explain. So the one that has it's a bit smoother, it's a bit more explanatory, is likely to be the later text, because the scribe is likely to do that, rather than the reverse. That's one thing that I looked at. Various criteria like this, and it's quite clear that the Samaritan Pentateuch, during the Second Temple period, which is when it was circulating, was doing some of this. Also, the Septuagint was doing some of that as well. And some of the Dead Sea Scrolls do that kind of thing. They are sort of expanding or editing a bit. The scribes had that kind of freedom during the Second Temple period. All right, now, here's the bottom line to give what's relevant to your question about the dating of the Pentateuch. The Samaritan Pentateuch, in fact, the Pentateuch as a whole, including the Hebrew text, does not anywhere mention Zion, Jerusalem, as the cultic center. That is, as the place where you're supposed to all go to offer sacrifices. The book of Deuteronomy only says that when you come into the land, you shall then offer sacrifice at the place where I will set my name, that I will choose, God says. He's going to choose a place in the land of Canaan, and it nowhere mentions Jerusalem. Now, if this text were in the Persian period, that is completely unexplainable, because in the Persian period, the Jewish people had been at Jerusalem for centuries, and in fact, one of their big agenda items was, according to the scholars, the same scholars that think that it was in the Persian period, like my friend James Watts. I'm friends with these people, okay? So we disagree, but we communicate and we're friends, and I've communicated with him personally about this. And even though I've written a couple of chapters in books that dialogue with him and disagreed. And James Watts thinks that the reason for the composition of Leviticus is for likely later priests, likely in the Persian period or somewhere around there. He's not super dogmatic on that, which is good. But later priests were saying these are the rules for the ritual system for their own benefit, because these ritual rules have the portions of the sacrifices and all these other things which go to the priests. So the priests would have written this to benefit themselves. Now, I argued against that because, for one thing, it shows the priest in a bad light in some ways. I mean, Aaron made mistakes, and his son made mistakes, and the priests have to do really dangerous work. So they're emphasizing these different things, and I pointed out, no, that's really not what Leviticus is all about. But the Samaritan Pentateuch, okay, argues for a different cultic center, and they would not be bothered by the Hebrew text as we have it. So the Hebrew text has to be early, and scholars are saying, oh, well, what happened was after the exile, then there were Jerusalem priests that collaborated with, and they communicated with, and the Samaritans to agree on a text, and that's why the texts are so close. Okay, well, as my friend John Bergsma, a Catholic scholar, points out, he points out if there were any compromises in making agreement, then it was the Samaritans that gained all the benefit. Because and how would this happen? The Jewish priests, as strong as they were not able to have in there anything about Jerusalem or Zion as being the cultic center. So that just doesn't make sense. What does make sense, and I pointed this out at the end of my chapter on the Samaritan Pentateuch, what does make sense is that there was a common text, and some scholars are saying that. There was a common text from which both streams came, the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint, as well as the Masoretic text, and that was already canonical. It was already basically fixed before it split into these branches, so that they were only authorized. The scribes only felt authorized to make very minor changes, and even then, things that had basis elsewhere in the Pentateuch. And then you have to ask the question, when was it that the Samaritans and the people of Judah were together? That the people of northern Israel and southern Israel, when were they together? So that they could have produced a canonical text that later became the standard for both of them. Well, you go back, we know about the divided monarchy. We know that it came to an end when northern Israel was taken captive in 722 BC by the Assyrians. And then there was a huge influx of refugees from the north that came into the south in the time of Hezekiah. Okay. So could it be then that they were combined, that they had their combined text, that it was from that union? But that isn't so terribly convincing. It makes it look much more like it was earlier, maybe during the united monarchy of David and Solomon. Now, Solomon reigned about 960 to about 920 or so BC. I'm just giving rough figures. So this is much earlier. This is united monarchy. And some scholars think, my teacher, Jacob Milgrom, thought that Leviticus was produced during the united monarchy. However, there are clear indications in the narrative of the Pentateuch that the people were not yet in the land of Israel, because there are texts in Leviticus that say, when you come into the land, then you do it like this. Okay. And within the narrative framework, we find also in Deuteronomy, it says, when you come into the land, then there's going to be a change in the way that you can slaughter animals that are sacrificable animals. You don't have to take them to the temple or to the sanctuary to slaughter them there as sacrifices. If you want an animal that's a sacrificial animal or sacrificable animal, like a sheep or a goat, or a bull or a cow, then you don't have to take it all the way to the sanctuary if it's too far. You could just slit its throat, slaughter it, drain out the blood, cover it up, bury the blood, and you can eat it outside there. So there are indications of change like that, but that's still in the future. So looking at the narrative framework, it just doesn't make sense to impose upon it a whole speculative, fictitious, alternative narrative framework, namely that during the exile, the Israelites, or the people of Judah, now the Jews, okay, didn't have a sanctuary. They just means through some kind of a wilderness experience. So they were relating to that and trying to be encouraged. And then they were setting up this temple, but they wanted authorization from a fictitious story that's in the past. That raises another problem. And that is that Moses is regarded as a pseudonym. Okay. How does pseudonymous composition work? Pseudepigraphic. Pseudepigraphic means false writing. Okay. We have pseudepigraphic writings from the Second Temple period. We have books of Enoch. We have books about the Testament of Levi and about Abraham, and all these texts that are these writers during the Second Temple period writing like what they thought it would have been like, and then they're attributing it to these Old Testament characters. Now that works if everyone believes that character existed at one time, right? But if that character is fictitious, how are you going to have a very convincing kind of a narrative framework based on something fictitious? Okay, now we could take an example. Let's say, okay, Peter from the story of Winnie the Pooh, all right? I think Peter is the boy's name, right? No, it's not Peter. It's Christopher Robin. Christopher Robin. Let's say Christopher Robin from the story of, do you know the story of Winnie the Pooh? Have you ever heard of that? It's a
Yeah,
fictitious
sure.
about a bear, and then there's a lot of other animals like Tigger the tiger that bounces, and that's why my wife calls me Papa T for my grandchildren. They call me Papa T, which means Papa Tigger, because I'm kind of a bouncy kind of a guy. And then you have the piglet, and you have Eeyore the donkey, all of those characters. Okay, you may have heard of them. So let's take Christopher Robin. All right, now we could make up a story like the Adventures of Christopher Robin, and we could put it in his name, Christopher Robin. He's a fictitious character, right? Everybody knows that. But if we make it like this, we have Christopher Robin's rules for how you should live your life. That's a different story. All right. People are going to say, oh, that was just made up by some person. That's their idea, maybe good advice. I should listen to it, but that's not authoritative. That's not the way the Pentateuch presents itself. It presents itself as authoritative from God. And how is that going to carry any weight if this pseudonymous name, Moses, didn't actually exist? You see the point? You can only build a really convincing pseudonym if someone existed. But if he really existed and wrote those books, then we don't have to talk about him being a pseudonym at all. So you have a lot of kind of circular reasoning, a lot of very illogical reasoning to try to put the Pentateuch very late. Now, so what? What difference does it make if the Pentateuch is from the 18th dynasty, time of Egypt, 1400s, time of Moses, a historical Moses, and the wilderness sanctuary actually existed, and so on, or whether you believe that all that's fiction and it was written much later. Here's the difference it makes in practical terms. You take, for example, some of the discussions that people have over morality and ethics now, okay, including about sexuality. And people are concerned about what the Bible says. Why? Because people believe that it comes from God, or at least it's supposed to come from God. Now, if it's written by people during the Second Temple period, like Leviticus is supposed to have been written by priests in the Jerusalem temple who are writing it for their benefit, then that's just their opinion, right? They're human beings. I may as well listen to one of these columnists in the United States. We had a columnist who wrote on family issues called Ann Landers, and there were others. They write giving advice. You know, we can. There are a lot of these people that are well respected. They're smart people. They will give wise advice, but you don't take it as the word of the Lord. You don't take it as that may affect my relationship with God and may affect my eventual salvation if I am disloyal to God. Not that we're saved by works and obedience, but we're saved by grace through faith. But that faith means that we accept God as the ruler, the Lord of our lives, and we're going to cooperate with him and accept his Holy Spirit to transform our lives into harmony with his principles of love on which his law is based. Okay? So if Moses was there and received messages directly from God, as the Pentateuch claims, then we better listen. It makes a big difference in terms of our relationship with God if we really believe in God. And what he says about creation, about the way the fall happened, about the covenants, the way we have relationships with him, like the biblical characters, all the background, pointing forward, the rituals pointing forward to Jesus, the Messiah, in the New Testament as being real, coming from God, and not just made up stories by later people who borrowed ritual ideas from the pagans in the ancient Near East, adapted them, and so on and so forth. It makes a huge difference to our faith. Now, what I've found in practical terms is that, and anyone can do this, they can put it to the test. I've written a book called Old Testament Law for Christians, in which I discuss the biblical laws. Okay. And I discuss them in terms of where to find them in the Bible, how to read them, their language, their background, relationship to ancient Near Eastern laws. And especially the big agenda of the book is to find out how and when to apply them to our lives. because we have to do cultural translation. Some of these laws we cannot keep anymore, like the festivals. Some Christians think we have to keep the Israelite festivals. Well, nobody does. The Jews don't keep them, okay? Because they require animal sacrifices at an authorized temple with authorized priests. Just look at Numbers 28 and 29. And nobody does this. Nobody can do it because there's no such temple system in existence. So all the festival observance, which is really nice, and I participated in this by Jewish people and others, is all adaptations of some aspects of those with liturgy that's been added later since the destruction of the temple. That's all very nice. But we cannot keep those festivals any longer. So when we come to the Pentateuch, we have to say, okay, we cannot keep all of those laws. All right. And that's okay. But there are many of them, even if they don't apply directly to our lives, they have principles that are underlying that can apply. Now, the Apostle Paul in the New Testament made an interesting application of the law of the ox that grinds out the grain. And he made the application of this to the minister who is a full-time minister living from his teaching of the gospel, which is providing a benefit to people. And Paul's point is that person should gain benefit, material benefit from their work so that they can survive. Okay. So that's why we pay ministers. Okay. And, but he uses what we call a responsible analogy. He's making an analogy from that law of the grinding out of the grain by the ox who's treading the grain and the minister. And what's common between the two? They're both workers, and they, just as the ox should gain the benefit of its work, the minister should gain the benefit of his work. That's the common element of the analogy. That's the underlying principle. And there are many other laws, and I point out a lot of these underlying principles, and also point out that the 10 Commandments, which are regarded by many Christians as all of the moral law that we have to keep, and the rest are all from Moses, and we don't have to worry about them. But wait a minute. In the Pentateuch, the books of Moses, including Leviticus, many of those laws are really applications or extensions of the principles in the 10 Commandments. You cannot separate them from the 10 Commandments. And furthermore, you find the two great principles of love in Leviticus 19:18, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And the biggest one is in Deuteronomy 6:5, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. Jesus quoted those in Matthew 22:37-40 as the two great commandments. And many of the commandments that are not in the 10 Commandments per se are still based upon those. The New Testament affirms those. Jesus did, Paul did in Romans 13. So what we can do then is look for the underlying principles which God has given us by his wisdom. And I've gained the benefit of blessing, of helping my wisdom in relationships with other people, my relationship with God, my relationship with myself, from looking at this divine wisdom. When you think about it, if God created us, what is the Bible? If it comes from God, what is the Bible? It's the manufacturer's handbook. It tells us. Now, I have a Toyota Corolla, okay? It's an older one. And it came with a handbook from the manufacturer, the Toyota company that built the car. And it tells what kind of oil to put in it and all the rest of it and that kind of stuff. And if I follow that, that's good because the car was built by those people and therefore they know how to keep it running, right? And so it is with us and God. God made us, and therefore he gives us the instructions for how to keep things running well, particularly now that we're in a faulty world, for now in a world of sin until Jesus comes. He teaches us how to get along, how to survive for the best, how to be a blessing to other people, and to succeed. And success has been wonderful when people have followed the biblical principles. In fact, in the Bible, we have the earliest manual of human rights in history that really work. In the ancient Near East, you didn't have those kind of rights for example, slaves and other people. The laws of Hammurabi prescribed the death penalty for anyone who even helps a slave escape. And yet, in the Bible, it undoes these things. And in Deuteronomy, it says you're not allowed to help. You're not allowed to return a slave to his or her master if they come to you. Obviously, they have a problem. And and it's cruel. You should not, you are forbidden to return them to their master. 180 degrees the opposite of what the laws of Hammurabi say. So the Bible is very strong and powerful on human rights and is the basis of human rights in our Western civilization. Where did that come from? Some philosophers sitting around making this up? We don't have anything like it in human history, in philosophy, for human beings to do that. It's unique, it's unusual, and I believe it comes from God. Okay, that was a bit more than what you probably asked for, but that's what I have to say on that. In a nutshell, there's more that could be said, but I should stop.
Oh, fascinating. Thank you so much, Professor Gane. And I have a lot of questions, but we cannot cover all. But I had in my channel all those scholars that you mentioned, like Alice Baker, Gary Ransburg. So they are really great minds, and we talked about those topics similar. So great.
Yeah.
And now I want to ask you, what do you think about Daniel Block's theory? He thinks that there was a first canon, let's say. First, it was Decalogue, Ten Commandments. Then Moses wrote laws. And third, canon was like when you combine with narrative voice that was written with commentaries and some things about 10th century BCE. So Gary Ransburg would say that language is from that period. So would you agree with that thinking? Is it likely, or what do you think?
Okay, good questions. Now, when we talk about the origin of the Pentateuch and going back to Moses, that's different from talking about what is the dating of the whole final canonical text as we have it now, which is the Masoretic text, basically. Now, when you read a modern Bible translation, what the translators do in most cases is that they try to do some textual criticism, okay? The translations are done by scholars like me. In fact, I was the primary translator for the Leviticus portion of the Common English Bible, which is a recent Bible translation. So I know how translators work because I am one. And so what we try to do is figure out the best scholarship on this, which can include, particularly in later books. Now, Leviticus, the Pentateuchal books don't have many variants because they were canonical so early. That, again, is another argument for them being early. Later books have many more variants. Differences between different manuscripts. And so, and manuscript traditions like the Septuagint, Dead Sea Scrolls, and so on. But when you look at these, at the text of Leviticus, yes, it's classical Hebrew, so it's pre-exilic. Block, Rendsburg agree with that. Exactly where to date it within the classical period, which goes for a very long time, many centuries. Classical Hebrew. And before that, there's early Hebrew. We have a few early Hebrew examples in the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15 and the Song of Deborah in Judges chapter 5, which is poetry. You don't mess around. You can't really update poetry too much because the language goes with the meter. And so we have apparently earlier forms that's recognized as early biblical Hebrew. Now, within classical Hebrew, how do you tell the difference between a text that's written in, say, 1400s versus the 700s or something like that, right? Now, there's a scholar by the name of Yoel Elitzur, who is one of our authors for our volumes. He's a member of our Exploring the Composition of the Pentateuch project with our conferences and our Zoom quarterly meetings. And he's an Israeli scholar. And he has been looking at the dating of texts within the classical period. And he finds that the Pentateuch is dated in the earlier portion of that. You can't really be so terribly precise in dating language. Language is a very slippery thing because words can last for a long time. They can change, new things can come in, but later writers can write in old kind of language and so on and so forth. So we know that very likely there were updating of language by scribes to make things understandable for later people. We talked about glosses, which are explanations. We know that the paleography, that is the shaping of the letters, is different because now it used to be argued that the Pentateuch could not have been written by Moses in an alphabetic script because there was no alphabetic script in the time of Moses. That has been proven to be wrong. We now have alphabetic script, evidence for it going back as early, a little bit of evidence going back as early as the 18th century BC. And one who has written on this is another one of our authors by the name of Rick Hess from Denver Seminary. So we know that he could have written in an alphabetic script, but it would have been a different alphabetic script than what we have now. I teach a course in Hebrew inscriptions, and we read inscriptions from, say, Hezekiah, the time of Hezekiah, 700s, the Salome inscription, where he tells about the tomb, the tunnel, Hezekiah's tunnel, and other texts from that period, or the Gezer calendar, which is 10th century, 900s BC, and it's quite a different script than what we have later in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is close to what we have now, which is really an Aramaic square script that was adapted because Aramaic became the lingua franca, the common language, in the later period. So there's obviously an updating of script. And with that, apparently there was updating of language. So when you look at the language, you can say, you can pretty clearly differentiate between pre-exilic and post-exilic. And Avi Horvitz did that. But to differentiate between, say, early divided monarchy, united monarchy, and a bit before that, it's very difficult. Now, if Gary Rensburg says the language may be at that period that he says, maybe starting as early as the 1100s BC, which would be the time of the judges, right? Then the latter period of the judges, a bit before David, then, okay, that could be so. That could be when the language is dated to. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the text originated then, okay? Because you would have had editing. We know that there was editing. There could have been editing later, even up to the time of Ezra. He was an editor, post-exilic editor. But what we're talking about is the origin of the text, the recording of what happened between Moses and God, the revelations that he got, and the basic content, okay, going back to an earlier period. And there are a number of us scholars in the Exploring the Composition of the Pentateuch project. When we discuss it, we believe that the scenario that's given, which is a very consistent scenario in terms of the narrative framework in the Pentateuch, is definitely pre-settlement. That is, it's in the wilderness before the Israelites entered into Canaan and conquered Canaan. And it would have been differently written. It would not have been expressed the same way if it had been written after the conquest. So we take it as earlier, before the conquest, in the wilderness, which it puts it before the period of the judges. Now, as I mentioned, there could be later editing. In fact, we know that there was. We see examples of it that really probably had to be. I mentioned, then the Canaanite was in the land. That's after the Canaanites are gone. I mentioned Or-Kasdim. That's probably a first millennium BC, much later, centuries later than the rest of the text. What about this one? In Numbers 12, verse 3, it says there that Moses was the most humble man on the earth. He's the humblest. Was that written by Moses? I'm the humblest. Probably not. You know, it's a bit. Now, Muhammad Ali could say he's a great boxer. He used to live here in Berrien Springs, close to where I live. And he used to say, I'm the greatest. You know, he was a boxer. But to say I'm the humblest, that's really strange. So it's probably written by a narrative writer. And there would have been a narrative recollections that were put in. But the basic revelations would have been kept intact. And then the recording of the journeys, Moses did that, and those kinds of things. The book of Leviticus, in fact, is mostly recording direct speech from the Lord. There's more direct speech from the Lord in Leviticus than any other book in the whole Bible, even though it's the shortest and middle book of the Pentateuch. You know, in the ancient times, they used to have chiastic or arch structures, A, B, C, B, A, or A, B, C, C, B, A, where the Pentateuch has 5 books, and Leviticus is right in the middle. So it's the middle center, and the center is regarded as especially important, at the center of the foundation of the whole Bible, okay? And it has more direct divine speech in it than any other book. Now, what matters is, did those messages come from the Lord? How they were actually put together and the whole thing edited and the narrative and with some narrators tying things together, this would happen later. But 2 Timothy 3:16 says, How much of Scripture is inspired by God, God-breathed, and profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for training in righteousness, and so on? How much of Scripture? All Scripture, all of canonical Scripture. And this is one of the problems with the historical critics. They were going back looking for, according to Johann Salomo Semler, he was a German scholar, looking for the word of God in Scripture, not taking the word of God as a whole as Scripture, with all Scripture as inspired, but looking for the word of God in Scripture. So it's like when you go to do archaeology, like my wife is going to do in 2 weeks. She's, well, less than that now, 10 days. She's going to fly to Jordan. I can't accompany her this time. I have many times. And she's going to an archaeological site because my wife is an archaeologist. She's going to be digging there in Jordan. Now, when you're doing archaeology, you're digging and you throw out all the dirt and you collect the treasure. So that's what scholars thought. You're throwing out all the later stuff, all right, that was just written by later editors or whatever. And then you're looking for the treasure. What goes back to God? And that's the words of the original prophet. Now, there was one, for example, in commentaries on Ezekiel, the great scholar Moshe Greenberg, I was taking a course in Ezekiel from him at Berkeley. He was visiting from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He was teaching us Ezekiel, which was the material from his first, well, it became his only because he got Parkinson's disease, the first volume of the Anchor Bible Commentary series on Ezekiel. He was finishing that volume. And he was talking about commentaries on Ezekiel. And there was one German scholar who was a critical commentarian. He accepted 2/3 of the book of Ezekiel as going back to the prophet. 2/3. 1/3 of it is later. Okay. So you really pay attention to that 2/3. And he had criteria to know what that 2/3 was. However, there was another scholar that accepted an original maybe 17 verses of the whole book of Ezekiel, which is 48 chapters, as going back to the prophet Ezekiel. And his criterion was that the prophet had to write in poetry, and whatever was actually poetry, according to his criteria, was from the prophet. Now, it was an entirely artificial, made-up criterion by the scholar, and it's not convincing at all, okay? Because it's just a made-up criterion. This is all you need to listen to going back to the prophet, is this. Now, I said at that point to Moshe Greenberg, I said to him, how much of your commentary are you going to accept as going back to the prophet Ezekiel? And he smiled and he says, I don't regard my commentary as a critical commentary, because the word critical in this context means that the scholar tries to reconstruct the original text of the book that he's working with. All right. And Greenberg says, I don't do that. I take the text as it is. That's the data. We work with that. Now, that's the same approach as the great scholar Rolf Rentdorf. Rolf Rentdorf was a student of Gerhard von Rad, who was a forum critic. And forum criticism is trying to find the original text by looking at the criteria of the original life situations where different passages occurred, and trying to date it and that kind of thing. Rolf Rentdorf turned away from that to a large extent. And when I was coming from a session at the Society of Biblical Literature in Denver, Colorado, years ago, on Pentateuchal source criticism, exactly the stuff we've been talking about, I was coming down the escalator with Rolf Rentdorf because I'd met him in Berkeley and we'd become friends. And Rolf Rentdorf said to me on that occasion, he said, I want to work with real texts, not homemade texts. That's what he said. I want to work with texts that we actually have the data. There is no external data for the existence of a J document, an E document for the documentary hypothesis. There is no external evidence for them. All we have is the text as we know it through the manuscripts, through the different text witnesses. The rest is all hypothetical. My teacher at the University of California, Berkeley, Isaac Kikuwata, he was a pioneer in rhetorical criticism, which is a different kind of criticism. It's looking at the rhetorical structure, different like A, B, kind of structures, or ABCBA chiastic structures and so on, the way the rhetoric is put together. Okay. And he said to me, he regards JEDP as scholarly phantoms. They exist in the minds of scholars. That's where they exist, and that's the only place they exist. And so I agree with that. I agree with that. And in all my years of studying at Berkeley, I studied for 2 years as a visiting PhD student at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I studied under, I think, 5 of the authors of the Anchor Bible Commentary series. And I was never convinced by the documentary hypothesis or by the late dating of the Pentateuch, by any of that. Did I answer your question? I probably told you a lot more than what you wanted to hear.
Yes, but I love those digressions. So keep adding. I enjoy really. So thank you again. And would you somewhat agree that the text in Leviticus is clearly different from the narrative sections of the Pentateuch and from parts that emphasize covenant and social laws like Deuteronomy? Because Dr. Rick Hess and Gary Rensburg and others would say that there is parts of Pentateuch that speak about the narrative and other that speak about legal cultic material and other. So do you see those different styles, emphasis, and other things?
Okay. In terms of styles, does a different style indicate a different author? All right. When you write if you write a thesis or a scholarly paper or an article, okay, or you write a love letter to your wife or a birthday note to your child, or a letter to a friend, those are different styles, but it's the same author, right? So there are different situations where there are different kind of styles that are called for. Now, you also mentioned about Daniel Block, and you're mentioning about Rensburg, and they're talking about different, what appear to be perhaps differences in the styles of the Pentateuch, according to narrative versus law, ritual law, or narrative of ritual performance, perhaps, like in Leviticus chapter 8 to 10, it's a narrative of the original consecration of the sanctuary. And so you have different styles in the Pentateuch. Now, could it be that the legal material and the material that is given as direct quotation from the Lord, that could be maybe earlier, that was collected in documents written down, maybe even by Moses, likely by Moses, I think, because otherwise, or dictated by Moses, but he would be the one who would be most likely to write if he had that background according to the Pentateuchal narrative. So that could have been there, and then you could have these various documents, and then they could be brought together with someone who knew the story, putting the story, the narrative in between, and that could be dating from a somewhat later time. We don't know. Could have been written by Moses or his assistant, by Joshua. We don't know. We don't know. And what we're trying to do in our whole exploring the composition of the Pentateuch project is to try to isolate raw data. Okay, raw data, and then build on that. Like with what I said about the Samaritan Pentateuch, we have the manuscripts, we have the dating of the manuscripts pretty solidly established from various criteria. One of them is paleography, that is the shape of the letters, and so on. And there's a little bit of give and take there, but not too much. We have a pretty good idea about the dating of the original Septuagint and so on and so forth. And so we try to stick as close as we can to data, and then make our conclusions as close to the data as we can. Now, when we get into the area of saying, well, it looks like this could have been a little bit later than this. Okay, that's fine. You can say that. But we have to say what Block says. I know Block. He's a good friend of mine. He's part of our project. He's one of our authors, as is Gary Rensburg. And what scholars admit is there's a limitation of evidence here, but this is what it looks like to me, the way it could have happened. So what we need to not do is we need to not have people listening to these scholars and say, I listened to Daniel Block or Roy Gane or Gary Rensburg or someone, and they're the expert, and therefore this is the way it is. No, we scholars know that we're looking at certain data. We're using our logic. We're trying to figure it out, and more data could come up, or a different angle of logic would come up that proves us that we're not right about this. And so we're tentative. That's one of our major methodological issues, is we're trying to avoid just a lot of raw speculation. And I think that's what we're doing in our Rethinking the Composition of the Pentateuch volume, which is going to be out soon. Whereas the other conference volumes, ECP 1, 2, and 3, and there's going to be another one later, those volumes are quite heavy scholarly volumes because they come from conference papers for scholars, okay? But this volume called Rethinking the Composition of the Pentateuch is written as a textbook with short chapters on a lot of different topics coming from all different angles. And it's not just for scholars, it's for other people who don't have all the background. There's a glossary of key terms, and we're going to explain things as we go, but we're trying to lay out the data and say, here it is. This is what I see in it, but I've laid out the data. You may come to a somewhat slightly different conclusion, and that's up to you. But at least here I'm doing the best I can. And not all of us agree on everything. Gary Rensburg has a little bit later dating of the original composition of the Pentateuch. Daniel Block, to some extent, a little bit later in some ways than some of the rest of us. And that's okay. That's why we talk to each other, and we're making progress.
Yes, amazing. Thanks for your explanations. And yeah, I wonder, how old is P source according to those scholars, such as your teacher Milgrom and other? They say like before 8th century, but what range would they give? Also, Israel Knoll, he will also be on my channel later in a few months. But do you know maybe what is the range of dating in that Kaufmann Schuler school? Yeah.
The Kaufmann school. Yeah. So the Kaufmann school has a P, priestly source, being pre-exilic, and before Deuteronomy. And however, the H so-called source, which would, each of these would have come from a scholar or a group of scholars living in ancient times, and or a priest or whatever, or prophet. I've argued that the Pentateuch goes back more to a prophet, more like Moses. So instead of JEDP, I have M for Moses. And one who agrees with me on that, not necessarily the dating, but one who agrees on the whole Pentateuch was written by one genius, someone who had something beyond the usual intellectual capability, is my friend Moshe Klein. Moshe Klein is an independent scholar living in Jerusalem, friend of mine, part of our project. And Moshe Klein has demonstrated that the Pentateuch, including the different books of the Pentateuch, are a sophisticated weave that is two-dimensional. It's not just the structure is not just like A, B, C, B, A, or whatever on one level. It's different levels. And I won't take time to explain how all of this works. But what he's seeing is such an amazing interweaving that is patterned of the individual Pentateuchal books and then the whole Pentateuch as a whole, that he sees that it couldn't possibly be just happenstance. It couldn't just be a coincidence. It had to be put together by some genius who was thinking like that or able to do that. So that's an interesting kind of a thing. So back to your question. What was your question again? Remind me.
Yes, a range of P source dating by Milgrom and that school. Yeah.
Oh yes. Okay. So for Milgrom, it's going to be before Deuteronomy. But what Milgrom has tried to do, he tried to look at some of the circumstances involving, for example, Moloch worship and those kind of things that are referred to in the later historical books. When was Moloch worship around? When was it a problem? And he sees that since it's addressed in Leviticus, in particularly Leviticus 18 and 20, then therefore you kind of match the subject matter with the historical period when that was an issue. Okay. And this is what many scholars have done, and many have argued for late dating. Now, I know from Milgrom's class and from talking with him personally that he thought that quite a bit of Leviticus could have gone back to the United Monarchy, Okay, but he shifted as time went on. He was influenced by Knoll, and so sometimes in his writings, in fact, you find that he contradicts himself because he changed his mind or something like that, which he prided himself in being willing to do, change his mind. And so to pin him down and say exactly when is a bit challenging, but I think he would say probably maybe 8th century with some editing, maybe later even, that kind of thing. But as I said, the ritual system he thought went earlier, so it could have begun quite early. So it was, in other words, it was actually performed at the Solomonic temple, these rituals, rather than just being fictitious. However, he did not go so far as to say this is from Moses, and there actually was a wilderness sanctuary. He didn't really talk about that or critique it so much. When I mentioned the possibility it went to Moses, he said, "Oh, that's an interesting idea." Oh, he didn't just discount it and brush it off. Oh, you think maybe that's a possibility? Oh, okay, and that was it. So it's a good question exactly, because he didn't say exactly when, because there were different aspects that could have belonged to different parts of that pre-exilic period, and allowing for maybe a little bit of post-exilic editing.
Yes, I like his reaction because when he hears something that comes from Moses, he don't laugh, but he says, "Oh, maybe, yeah, it's possible at least." Yeah, so I
Yeah,
like that.
and
So yeah,
Milgrom was happy to change his mind. Moshe Greenberg came, I told you, and I studied Ezekiel with him. During that semester, he was sponsored by, I think, the Taubman endowment. And it's, I guess, probably a Jewish family that gave money for a visiting professor from the Hebrew University. And what went with that was a lectureship series. So he gave 3 public lectures. The topic that he chose was biblical prose prayer, and that's published as a little volume called Biblical Prose Prayer. I went to all 3, and in one of those, he referred to his friend Jacob Milgrom and something that Jacob Milgrom had written, and he mentioned it with approval. That is, he agreed with what Milgrom said. So a night or two later, Milgrom's students, including me, were at Milgrom's house for his seminar, and during the break that his wife arranged some refreshments for us, we mentioned to Milgrom that Moshe Greenberg mentioned what you said, and he liked it. He agreed with you. And Milgrom just says, "Oh, yes. But since then, I've changed my mind." So
yeah, he's great.
Milgrom is kind of a moving target. You can't say just, exactly here. But later on, now when, interestingly, here's an example of something that happened. Milgrom regarded, late in his career, and I discussed this with him, he regarded part of Leviticus 16, starting with verse 29 and following, as being H material. He agreed with Israel Knoll on that. Okay, so that the earlier part, the basic ritual itself, is P. But then later is this H section, which talks about the date, the 10th day of the 7th month, and it prescribes afflicting yourself, that is self-denial, inui nefesh, to be done on this day, and so on. And this is a later addition by this holiness source for the people to live holy lives in relation to the Day of Atonement. Okay, so I knew this, and then I presented a paper at the Society of Biblical Literature, and Milgrom was there. And Milgrom asked a question because I was discussing the Day of Atonement. And he asked the question, well, what about verses 29 and following? And I knew what he meant. He was meaning, is this a different author? Because I was referring to the whole thing as a unity, right? And that material I subsequently got into my book called Cult and Character. And he put a very nice affirmation on the back of that book, although he didn't agree with everything. Okay, so he asked this question and about the the latter part of Leviticus 16 on the Day of Atonement? I replied, in your Anchor Bible commentary on Leviticus 17 to 22, on page 1100 and so, you said that one characteristic of the holiness source is that sin is not remediable by sacrifice. However, here in Leviticus 11:29 and following, you have in verse 30 that the people's sin is removed by the ritual, that is, by the sacrifice. I said, that's not very good. H, is it? And everyone was stunned because they thought that I'd memorized this entire 3-volume commentary of the Anchor Bible because I cited the exact page. They thought I'd memorized the entire thing. I hadn't. What I did was I anticipated his question. I knew what he was thinking. I knew what question he was likely to ask. He asked exactly that question, and I had memorized the exact place in his commentary. So everybody thought I was smarter than I really am. Anyway, but that's just an example of these kinds of issues. You see, it's inconsistent. What's being said there, for example, about H of the latter portion there, this being later and it's not, and then there's certain theological characteristics of H. It's not consistent. Doesn't work.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing this experience. And yeah, do you at least accept the division between first part as a P material or something like that, and second part as a H, not as a separate sources or datings, but as a structure? So do you accept those divisions? Like,
right. There is a thematic difference in terms of the first part of the book is concentrating on the ritual system. It starts off in chapters 1 to 7, outlining the different kinds of sacrifices, giving instructions for the people in general, and especially the priests in chapter 6 and 7. And then you have in chapters 8 through 10, you have the consecration and inauguration of the priest and the sanctuary, and the aftermath, the tragic aftermath with Nadab and Abihu. Then in chapters 11 to 15, you have the issue of what's clean and what's not clean, pure and impure, all of which is background then for chapter 16, the Day of Atonement. Now, chapter 17 is kind of a bridge. It's a bridge in its theme because it's referring to sacrifices. If you want to slaughter an animal for sacrifice, you can't just go outside the wilderness camp because there the people were slaughtering them for goat demons, okay? So it says that you have to slaughter it inside the camp and you have to offer it as a sacrifice, a well-being offering, shlamim sacrifice. This is only in the wilderness setting, and it doesn't make sense otherwise. And there it has other issues about rituals in chapter 17. So that's kind of like a bridge between the earlier rituals chapters. And then in chapter 18, you introduce holiness for the rest of the people. Now, the term holiness isn't introduced there as a major thing until you get to Leviticus 19. 19 verse 2 says, you shall be holy as I am holy. Okay. And there you have also a lot of laws that is a compendium of miscellaneous laws, which are for the people and of course for the priests, which are some ritual, but a lot of them are ethical and so on and so forth, and so on. A big mixture. And it's like God is saying, doesn't matter how you categorize these, just listen to all of them. All of them are ones that you should obey. Now, chapter 18 and 20 are very much similar because chapters 18 and 20 both deal with incest. They both refer to Moloch worship. They refer to other forms of sexual problems and so on. And so chapter 20 really repeats quite a lot of what's in 18, but giving penalties, whereas chapter 18, that is specific penalties. Chapter 18 just has a lump penalty of you'll be cut off from your people. Okay, so that means your line of descendants will be coming to an end. So Mary Douglas, an anthropologist, a British anthropologist, has seen this, and she said, okay, you got these two chapters that are mirroring each other. And then in the middle is chapter 19, which is a really pivotal chapter. It has the law about love. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, right in the middle of that chapter, verse 18. And so she built her structure of Leviticus around that. Now, other scholars have built the structure of Leviticus For example, William Shea, around the chiastic arrangement in verses of chapters 1 to 16. And they see 1 to 16 as the first part, then 17 to 27 as the latter part. Most scholars have seen chapters either 17 or 18, because 17 is like a transitional chapter, and then 18 clearly gets into laws for the people at large through chapter 26. Now, chapter 27 has been regarded by many as an appendix because it follows chapter 26, where you come to a conclusion at the end. You got the blessings and curses for the covenant in chapter 26, and it comes to a wrap-up, a summary conclusion. Chapter 27 also has a wrap-up summary conclusion at the end of it. So what scholars have said, 27 is an appendix. It's stuck on later. However, when you look more closely at it, the whole structure works well also to keep 27 as part of the structure. And in fact, it's embedded thematically. Chapter 27 is based upon partly chapter 25 because it refers to the Jubilee law of returning land and so on and so forth. And so there are certain things that just connect these together. So it's much more difficult to argue that it's just an authorial appendix that was added later. Yes, it is a concluding chapter, no question, because it's about dedications to the deity, which is ritual matters. But it has to be where it is because it refers to earlier things. And I wrote a chapter in the book, which is called, it's the memorial volume for Jacob Milgrom after he died. Myself and Ada Tagar-Cohen edited this volume on recent developments in the study of all of this. I could dig up the title of this. Anyway, in there, I presented a reaction to James Watts. I mentioned to you that he thinks that it's in the Persian period, that it's for the benefit of the priests. And I pointed out that really Leviticus is a lot of what affects the structure of Leviticus is didactic, it's teaching. So it builds on earlier information. So chapters 1 to 6 are clearly, chronologically, those instructions would be after the priests are already functioning and so on, but they don't start functioning until chapter 8, which is later. So it's really structured in a way for teaching, because you can't understand the consecration, inauguration of the priests, which have complicated priestly ritual complexes, which include the rituals that are given in detail in the earlier chapters. So it's given in a teaching way. I need to understand this to understand this. And the same thing is true with chapter 27. So it's true that there are thematic progressions from focusing on the ritual to focusing more on the people as a whole. But Leviticus 17 to 26 also goes back to ritual matters because you have in chapters 21 and 22 about the lifestyles of priests. Also, it has about the qualifications of priests. They have to be pure when they officiate. They cannot be blemished, physically blemished. Then you can't offer unblemished animals. That's all about the ritual system. And then you get to chapter 23, which is all about holy times. Chapter 24, 1 to 3, is about the lampstand with 7 branched candlesticks. And you have to supply oil for the lamps in the sanctuary. That's a ritual. And then verses 5 to 9 of chapter 24 is all about the bread of the presence. Another ritual, placing the bread. So you can't just say that one part is all about ritual and one is not. You have different blocks of material, but they make sense in relation to each other. And there's a reason why they are there in terms of the overall weaving structure that this is placed with themes and topics next to each other. So
amazing. Thank you. Yeah.
To answer your question, I do not make a sharp break between P and H. I do not. Because these things go interwoven. And there was another scholar, I'd have to try to remember his name, wrote a book in which he really demonstrated this. It's about holiness, and where he pointed out also there are just so many connections between these parts of Leviticus that it really doesn't work to sort of separate them.
Yes, if you remember that name, please tell me. But yeah, meanwhile, I wanted to ask you about biblical inspiration, because it is easy sometimes to argue for inspiration for Genesis and other books that has narratives, many events, prophecies. But how would you argue the inspiration for those who maybe don't believe in those books, Leviticus, Numbers, because we have many laws and things. So, is there anything in the book about structure, language, revolutionary ideas, some great laws, anything that points to some beauty and inspiration? What do you think? Do you have any example?
As I pointed out before, are we talking about the inspiration of the whole scripture or the Pentateuch particularly?
No, no, just Leviticus and Numbers. Do you see anything remarkable in those books?
Right. Um, well, for one thing, is the miracles. Because if it's true, I mean, for one thing, how did this group of slaves ever manage to get out of Egypt when Egypt was under a superpower? Now, there are a lot of scholars, including Gary Rensburg, that think that the Exodus happened in the time of the 1200s BC, in the time of Ramses II, who was a very powerful pharaoh. Some of the rest of us, including my fellow teachers here at Andrews University, they're archaeologists and historians, accept the biblical chronology in First Kings, I think it's 6 verse 1, where it says that the building of the Temple of Solomon was 480 years after the Exodus from Egypt. And so we accept the earlier dating, which is during the 18th dynasty of Egypt in the mid 1400s BC. And this would have been around the time of the reign of Tutmosis III, okay? Whether he was exactly the pharaoh of the Exodus, who drowned in the sea, he may have been. I mean, for one thing, in the mummy room in the Cairo Museum in Egypt, the mummy room, I've been there, and you can see these Egyptian mummies, these embalmed pharaohs, okay, that have been found in their tombs. And you walk around this room, it's not that big, and in plexiglass cases, you're looking at the pharaoh, the actual pharaoh that was there in ancient times. They're all kind of shriveled up like prunes, but that's their face, okay? There's a woman in there that maybe they think could be Hatshepsut, that some people think could be the adopted mother of Moses, the princess of Egypt that adopted him and became a queen. That is, Hatshepsut became a queen. And I've looked into the face of Tutmosis III and Ramses II and these guys. They were extremely powerful. Now, for a group of slaves to break away from that, something unusual must have happened. Now, you could say, well, where's the evidence in Egyptian history? We have lots of Egyptian texts. Not a single mention of that event is in any of those texts. Neither is there an indication of any of their other defeats, because ancient Near Eastern kings never admitted defeats. It sounds like a rather current American president, doesn't it? Okay, I won't go into that. They never admitted defeat. The Hittites and the Egyptians fought World War I, two superpowers, at a place called Kadesh on the Orontes River in Syria. Both of them claimed to have won the battle. So scholars say, well, maybe it was a draw, maybe it was a tie, but they both claimed to have won. So you don't expect to find any indication. You don't find any indication in Assyrian annals about the defeat of Sennacherib, king of Assyria, when he lost 185,000 of his soldiers trying to besiege Jerusalem. And my teacher, Moshe Weinfeld at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, when we were discussing this part of Isaiah that talks about this, said, and he wasn't necessarily a believer in the Bible, per se, in terms of miracles. He's rather a secular Jew. But he said, scholars don't know how to account for the fact that Jerusalem didn't get taken by Sennacherib. When the Assyrians laid siege to a city and they wanted to take it at that period, the height of Assyrian power, they took it in every case. There is absolutely nothing to explain why they didn't take it. Something very unusual must have happened. And Sennacherib tells about it in his annals, but never mentions his defeat. He shut up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. I'm quoting from Sennacherib. Okay, but he never admits his defeat. So we don't expect to find anything like that in the Egyptian text. But the Israelites had to go through that wilderness. How could a whole bunch of people get through the wilderness? How could they cross the Red Sea? There was no bridge on the Red Sea. How could they cross it? Now, this reminds me of a story that illustrates the point, I think, rather well. And that is, the story goes, and it's just a story, okay, but it illustrates the point. Well, maybe it happened, I don't know, but I can't prove it. The story goes that there was a hippie. Now, do you know what a hippie was? Hippie is back in the 1960s and 70s. They were, I think, mainly in America, in the United States. They were people that, the guys wore long hair, and they wore certain kinds of dress, and they loved flowers and peace, and they smoked marijuana, and they took LSD drugs, and they drove around in Volkswagen minivans that were painted with flowers and all kinds of stuff. Okay, flower show, and they lived in communes, and they had free sex and all that. That's hippies, all right. Now the story goes that there was a hippie in New York City, in Central Park in New York City, and he had just accepted the Lord, and he believed now in the Bible, and he's reading the Bible for the first time, and he's sitting there on the ground, on the grass, by a sidewalk, reading the story in Exodus about the Israelites crossing over the Red Sea. And he goes, wow, cool, man, groovy, far out. This is amazing. And an atheist walked by. The atheist said, what are you reading? He said, well, I'm reading the Bible. It says here that God opened up the Red Sea and all the Israelites passed through on dry ground. The atheist said, it wasn't the Red Sea, it was the Reed Sea. And there was only 6 inches of water in it. Oh, well, thanks for the information. And he goes back to reading. Oh, wow, cool, groovy, man, far out. The atheist comes back and says, what now? And the hippie says, God drowned the whole Egyptian army in 6 inches of water. The stories just don't make sense unless you accept the place of God in them. And I have found, as I said earlier in my testimony in life, I have found that the principles make sense. They make sense in my life. They make sense in other people's lives. Other things don't make sense. Now, here's why I believe in the Bible as a whole. Okay. And that is, years ago, I lost my love for someone I really should love. Okay. And it was very, very painful for me. Maybe the most painful experience of my life. I didn't have any more love, and I looked around in my heart and there was no love there because they had wounded me and I felt betrayed. But I needed love for that person. So what did I do? I claimed a promise in the Bible. And the promise is in Romans 5, verse 5, and it says, the Holy Spirit pours love into your heart where there's not love. Now, I'm descended from pirates, literally. Okay, I'm descended from pirates. I won't go into the details. So in my ancestry, love isn't one of the major characteristics, that it's really natural. Okay, and I didn't have any love there. There was no love there. I couldn't sit on the ground and do transcendental meditation, looking at my belly button, trying to whip up love. There was no love there. I needed transcendental medication. And so I prayed, God, create love in me the way you created light in the beginning. Give me love. And he did. And he put love there, and it stayed and it grew. And that for me is a miracle. I know that it's a miracle. I mean, people could dispute my story, but it's my story and I get to tell it, right? And nowadays, listening to stories is important for people, okay? And my story is that when I called up God with my so-called cell phone, there was someone on the other end of the line. And he answered me and did something I could not do for myself. And it was a miracle. And it was a miracle in harmony with what I asked, which was in harmony with what is in the Bible. That he'll pour love into my heart, which is the most important thing for me to have, because it's the basis of harmony with him, harmony with everyone else. And it's the basis of his law. Transforms. And that for me is evidence that I have in my personal life. I had faith before, but I really have faith now because he did something for me that is very unusual, very, very miraculous. I've also been saved from death in about 8 situations where I came within maybe a microsecond of getting killed. In some cases, very, very close to getting killed. And statistically, this is a bit above the average. So I believe that God has been protecting me. When I apply the principles in the Pentateuch to my life, even if I don't fully understand them, maybe I don't fully feel comfortable with them in some cases, they work. They work. And Deuteronomy 10, verse 13, Moses says to the Israelites that God has given you these laws for your good. It's not just for his good, like the ancient Near Eastern gods and their literature did things that were for their good. The human beings were their slaves. But God, he doesn't need what we have to give him. He gives it because he loves us. And he gives it for our benefit. And I found that to be true. I've claimed that promise. I've tested it in my life. And I dare anyone out there who doesn't believe to try it out and see how it works. And to look at history and see how it's worked for people who did try it out.
Wow, wonderful experience and really powerful. Thank you so much, Professor Gane. And I have just 2 questions more if you have time to ask about our topic. So, can we talk about Numbers a little? Because it's one of the better preserved books of the Pentateuch, according to scholars. And we have the Ketef Hinnom scrolls that points to the plausibility of a pre-exilic written tradition, at least of passages from number 6. So how you view that? Does that points to earlier period? And also Deir Alla inscription, there is also parallels. So what do you think?
Very good point. And of course, I referred to both of these in my commentary on Numbers, in that commentary on Leviticus and Numbers for the NIVAC application commentary series. And when it comes to the Ketef Hinnom, Ketef means shoulder. So, and Hinnom is the valley. So it's the shoulder of the valley. It's a little piece of land that kind of sticks out into being over the valley. And this was found a number of years ago. I've seen these silver amulets. They were found with a burial there. They're little pieces of silver, very, very, very small. And they were engraved, scratched with silver. Very, very hard to read. We read them in my inscriptions class, but we blow it up so that we have a photograph or a drawing that makes it larger. And these are fragments of not just the priestly blessing, which is found in Numbers chapter 6, but also some other parts of the Pentateuch and Deuteronomy and so on are woven in, put in there. So what does this mean? These from about 700 BC or so, as I recall. So you could say, aha, therefore the whole book of Numbers was already around in 700s BC, and therefore it's quoted from. Well, that's possible. You can't prove it from those silver amulets, which are in the Israel Museum, which is where I saw them. You can't prove it from that. What you can show is that those elements of text were there. Now, the fact that it does interweave with other texts there, that's one of the criteria, one of the evidences that a text is really quoting and referring to other existing texts if it combines them like that, pulls from here, pulls from there, and so on. It's not just in one place. So it doesn't just give evidence about Numbers 6 or the book of Numbers. It gives evidence about the others. So at least some parts of what we now have in the Pentateuch were in existence at that point. That's what we can say, if we're going to just stick to the data without speculating. When it comes to Deir Alla, this is very interesting because this is down in the Transjordan, which is now the country of Jordan. And at this place, and I've been there too, when we were excavating in Jordan, we went and visited this place. There were found inscriptions on plaster walls, as I recall. And these date from, what is it, the 8th century BC, something like that. I forget exactly.
I think 825, so something like 9th century, yeah.
9th century, okay. All right. It's a little while since I looked at that. And so these texts are very interesting because they refer to Balaam, son of Beor, who is exactly the person in Numbers chapter 22 to 24. Balaam, who was commissioned by Balak, the king of Moab, to go and curse Israel because he was afraid to attack them militarily. Okay, so the same guy, not only is he have the same name, he has the same profession. He's a prophet. And he is involved in these texts and interacting with the gods. And the gods give him revelations, including at night, which is another narrative characteristic we find in Numbers 22. And then he gets this revelation about these disasters that are going to happen and so on and so forth. It's very clear, though, that this is a pagan text because he's in touch with pagan gods. He's referring to disasters that are going to happen. And this correlates again with what the Bible is indicating, that Balaam was apparently a prophet who was in touch with the true God. But then he apostatized. He went away, and then he went back to his home a bit. But then he came back and he wanted that reward, see, from Balak. And so he offered to help lead the Israelites into sin, to separate them from their God so that they could be destroyed. And in fact, their God would destroy them, which is what he did. And he got the Moabites, who were allied with the Midianites, to infiltrate the Israelite camp with women, who invited Israelite men to feast and to indulge in idolatry that was connected with the feasting, that is, offering sacrifices and eating the sacrificial food and that kind of thing. And then there was a terrible plague, and the Lord killed a lot of these people, thousands of them, tens of thousands, until Phinehas stopped the plague. Okay, that's in Numbers chapter 25. And then later in the book of Deuteronomy, not Deuteronomy, I mean Numbers 31. Numbers 31, it refers to Balaam again, that Balaam was with the Moabites and so on when the Israelites then attacked them. The Lord told the Israelites to attack them and so on as punishment for what they did. So they attacked this was particularly the Midianites on this occasion, but they were allied with the Moabites, so they were presumably together. And with the Midianites there, and this whole group, was Balaam, and he was killed. I think that's, if I remember, it's verse 8 of Numbers 31. I'd have to look that up, but I think it may be verse 8. So we have so many correlations between these. Now, the one who really discusses these correlations in a lot of detail is Baruch Levine in his Anchor Bible commentary on Numbers. Discusses the Deir Alla inscription in detail in relation to Numbers 22 to 24. So you can find, if you look under Numbers 22 in his commentary, Anchor Bible commentary, you can find his discussion of that there. These are really supporting, in some ways, the historicity of the biblical text, and certainly that it is pre-exilic in terms of its material. That is, what's in it, the information that we have in it, that people refers to, and so on. And some of the text is actually pre-exilic. You can't prove that the whole thing is that early on that basis. There are other reasons why we think that, because of the place of Numbers in the Pentateuch, because of its life setting, because of its dating of its language, the Samaritan Pentateuch again, and so on and so forth. So there's other reasons, but this just does support, it correlates with the dating. Now, one thing that I have not mentioned, you mentioned Deir Alla, which comes from an ancient Near Eastern setting. It's an ancient Near Eastern text. It's not an Israelite text. We find other ancient Near Eastern texts that that correlate in many ways with the early Israelite, for example, ritual system, and with early Israelite culture, with language, and so on. We find Ugaritic texts, we find Akkadian texts, which are texts from Mesopotamia, Assyrian Babylonian texts, and a lot of these texts are early. The city of Ugarit was destroyed in the 1200s BC during the Sea People's invasion, and the 1200s were during the period of the Judges, which is really very early. The Hittite Empire was also destroyed by the Sea People's invasion, and the Hittites, who had the Hittite language, which was an Indo-European language, it's not Semitic, it's related distantly to English. That empire ended, that is the empire phase, in the 1200s BC, which is early, again, about the period of the Judges. Now, there are correlations that are very significant. For example, one who's done a lot of work, starting with the scholar Mendenhall years ago, pointed out that there are strong similarities between Hittite covenant treaty documents, where the Hittite emperors would make treaties with lesser kings, and these treaty documents have the same format as the format of Pentateuchal books like Exodus and or Exodus through Leviticus and so on, and Deuteronomy, especially Deuteronomy. So they have the same format as the Hittite books. Now, other scholars came along and they said, well, like, for example, Moshe Weinfeld, that I studied with him in Jerusalem, and Moshe Weinfeld tried to argue, no, they're really closer to the Assyrian first millennium BC texts, like the Esarhaddon Treaty in the Assyrian period. This would be before the end of the Assyrian Empire. Okay, so this is much, much later. Esarhaddon lived in like the 600s BC. And however, when you compare the formats of the Hittite treaties and the Assyrian treaties and the biblical treaties, that is the treaties between Israel and God, Kenneth Kitchen put out a big, huge volume collection of all the treaties in one volume with notes, translation, the original text in transliteration, and so on. And this is really the definitive work on treaties. And he points out, Kenneth Kitchen points out, that the biblical treaties are much closer to the Assyrian treaties. For example, the Assyrian treaties have no blessings in them for obedience, like the Israelite text. And the Hittite text, some of those give advantages, which would be, that is, advantages of obedience to the treaty, which would be like the like the blessings. Okay, so that's one thing. In other words, there's some parts of the treaty format that are just missing later on in Assyria. Now, the Hittite texts are old, because the Hittite Empire ended 1200s. That's fact. I mean, that's a raw fact. So these texts could not be later than that. And then in terms of rituals, I've found so many parallels between Hittite texts and early Mesopotamian texts, including Sumerian going back before the time of Abraham texts, to the Israelite rituals, that you cannot say that these are rituals that had to be invented later, that is, after the exile in the Persian period. No, these kinds of ritual forms, including purifying temples, like on the Day of Atonement, purifying the sanctuary. You got rituals like that going back to the time of the Nanshe hymn, about 2100 BC in Sumerian text, and Hittite text, like the fourth day of the ninth year festival of Telepinu. I've written about these texts. This is really early stuff, and so, and you have amazing correlations. For example, there's a text of Uru Inimgina, or alternatively Uru Kagina. He was a king in Sumer who was before the time of Abraham, and you have their ritual laying of bread in multiples of 12 loaves before the deity. Okay, like the laying of the bread of the presence, 12 loaves in Leviticus chapter 24 and earlier in Exodus. So amazing correspondences. And yet Leviticus takes those things, and I've written about the bread of the presence, that the Lord has similar rituals, yes, but they're a little bit different, to show that he does not actually eat this bread. The bread is eaten by the priest. All he gets is the incense. He doesn't consume the bread. So he doesn't need human food, as the ancient Near Eastern gods were supposed to need human food to be given to them by those people. Now, this material is collected in the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds Commentary on Leviticus in Volume 1, where I wrote the Leviticus section, and you can find this material collected there. You asked earlier if I could find the reference. I mentioned that there was a guy who was connecting the Holiness Code with the earlier part of Leviticus, and I found it here by just looking at my endnote-bibliography database, and the name is Lee Trevaskis. Trevaskis is Trevaskis. Trevaskis. Lee is Leigh. And the book is dated 2011, and it's called Holiness, Ethics, and Ritual in Leviticus, Holiness, Ethics, and Ritual in Leviticus, published by Sheffield Phoenix Press.
Oh, thank you so much for remembering that. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, the other thing that I was going to mention to you was the title of the Milgrom Memorial volume. And even though I was the co-editor, I've been involved in a lot of projects lately and I haven't remembered everything, but I can just show you that real quick. Okay, Roy personal info. Here we go. And that has some interesting stuff in it. Now, not all of it, of course, is material that I agree with, just as not everything in the Rethinking the Composition of the Pentateuch volume is everything I agree with. But in fact, I don't always agree with everything that I've written. And when I disagree with myself, I say so. Okay, this is called Current Issues in Priestly and Related Literature, the Legacy of Jacob Milgrom and Beyond. So Current Issues in Priestly and Related Literature, the Legacy of Jacob Milgrom and Beyond, dated 2015, edited by Roy E. Gane, that's me, and Ada, that's A-D-A, last name is Tagar-Cohen, capital T-A-G-G-A-R hyphen capital C-O-H-E-N, and it's published by the Society of Biblical Literature as part of their resources for biblical study. So a number of the contributors there were, of course, my classmates from Berkeley who studied under Milgrom, and a number of these, most of them are critical scholars. And you have mine in there about didactic logic in Leviticus, and I'm arguing for Leviticus being produced by a prophet rather than priests, and for the structure to be based especially on teaching rather than on just propaganda by priests for their own benefit. So, but there are other articles. There's one very interesting one by Moshe Klein, I mentioned him, on structure of Leviticus, the interwoven structure. He has an article in there, and there are others by others. But don't all assume that everyone agrees with me, because that's not the case.
Amazing. Thank you, Professor Gane. And lastly, I want just to ask you, are there any examples of early prophets such as Amos, Micah, Hosea, and other books that are pre-exilic that quotes Leviticus and Numbers, and that shows that those books are not from after exile or exilic period? So that's my question. And give any conclusion at the end. What would you say to people that really don't like to read those books, Leviticus and Numbers? So what would you say to them? Yeah, that's it.
Okay, those are two separate questions. The first question is a really good one, a very important one. And that is in the area of reuse. Okay, so that is reuse of by later writers of earlier material. And some of our writers are specialists in this. In this volume, Rethinking the Composition of the Pentateuch, we have Kenneth Berglund, a student of mine, and then his friend Felipe Massati. These two guys started the Exploring the Composition of the Pentateuch project. They were my doctoral students that I told you about. And both of these guys have been working with reuse. What are criteria for knowing which text is earlier when one text may quote another one or just allude to it? It may not be as tight as a quote. There may be similar words, similar themes, whatever, but pretty clearly there is a relationship between the two. They've been building on the work of some scholars, Lyons and Tuman are scholars at the University of St Andrews in Scotland, and others, building upon their work and coming up with some criteria for knowing how we know that there is reuse going on, and how do we know which one is earlier, okay? Which one is drawing upon the other one? And they've been looking, Kenneth Berglund's dissertation was looking at reuse of the prophets in the Torah, as I recall. Felipe Massati and the reuse of some apocalyptic work in classical prophets like Ezekiel. So Daniel and Ezekiel and so on and so forth. And they have been working on refining the methodology. Now, we have a whole section of our Exploring the Composition of the Pentateuch volume dedicated to this topic of reuse and looking at, do you find reuse of, say, prophetic materials in the Pentateuch or vice versa, okay? And what scholars have found, there is no solid evidence at all for reuse of prophetic material in the Pentateuch, including Leviticus. None. But there's a lot of evidence for it going the other way. Okay. There is some evidence for inter-Pentateuchal reuse, that is Deuteronomy reusing what's in Exodus and so on and so forth, like Deuteronomy 15, Exodus 21 about slavery, things like that. But in terms of outside the Pentateuch, there is no solid evidence for anything in the Pentateuch being reusing something later, and that is meaning that the Pentateuch would be later than that prophetic material. Okay, and what now scholars have alleged these things, have assumed these things, but they can't prove it. And so we have, I think, Rahel Wells maybe looking at Amos. Amos is one of the very earliest of the prophetic books, and looking at the reuse there. Now, let me show you. I think it may help to show you briefly, and then I'll talk briefly about why we should read Leviticus when it's so unattractive. Can I share my screen briefly?
Sure. Let me give you just.
Okay, so what I'm going to show you is the table of contents of our Rethinking the Composition of the Pentateuch book that's coming out.
Yes, I read the first part, but I'm waiting for second and others. So I heard that there will be also fourth volume. So
there will be a fourth volume, yes. But what I'm talking about is this textbook volume, Rethinking the Composition of the Pentateuch. Editors, that's the editors. Table of contents. Okay, now this is not completed yet, but dedication, preface, and so on, chronology, maps, and so on. Now, introduction toward a positive model for the composition of the Pentateuch. So this is an introduction, which I drafted, and then the others have been working on editing it. We just have finished it. And then we have a brief history of the documentary hypothesis, pseudonymity, article by Daniel Block. Then setting the stage, this is background. Multi-lens approach is reading strategy. The textual evidence, that is laying out the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, Samaritan Pentateuch, Dead Sea Scrolls. Ellen Millard, empirical evidence and models. This is dealing with ancient Near Eastern evidence. Ellen Millard, very, very unfortunately, just passed away recently. Great scholar. And looking at, he was looking at material from Mesopotamia and comparing with the biblical material. James Hoffmeyer compares Egyptian material. He's an Egyptian specialist. Here's Baker, Scotty Baker, looking at the construction of the sanctuary that I told you about. Okay, then the Pentateuch and ancient Near Eastern literature. Literary culture, that is writing, alphabetic script, cuneiform script. Gary Rensburg, narrative text. Then the different genres of the Pentateuch that are in comparison with ancient Near Eastern texts, comparing narrative, legal, cultic text, that's ritual text, poetic texts, hortatory, those are texts to persuade people to comply with the laws. Then linguistic dating, a whole section here, methodology, loanwords, narrative text, then the different kinds of text in the Pentateuch, strata, in classical biblical Hebrew. I told you about Yoel Elitzur, who is writing about within classical biblical Hebrew. How do you break it down into different subsections with different dates, one after the other? Then literary styles, coherence, and composite text. We're looking at this a lot because the neo-documentarians are trying to say that you can't read the Pentateuch, including Leviticus, as a coherent text because it's broken up different authors where you can see these narrative disjunctures. Okay, and then the different genres in the Pentateuch in terms of their literary styles. Then literary structure and unity. Gary Rensburg on these different books. And then I have one that was really difficult to write on the theme of the whole Pentateuch. Do we have a coherent theme of the whole Pentateuch? How that fits together with sub-themes and so on. Building to some extent on some previous work like David J.A. Klein's, who wrote on the theme of the Pentateuch. Then interbiblical reuse, and here it is. This is why I thought of showing you this. Interbiblical reuse in and on the Pentateuch. Methodology for determining reuse and direction of dependence. intratextual networking in the Pentateuch. As I mentioned, the Pentateuch quotes itself or refers to itself in different ways. And then interbiblical use between the Torah and the former prophets, the major prophets, minor prophets, and writings. So we're really thoroughly covering this. And then conclusions regarding selected Pentateuchal texts that are used, especially in the debates. They're debated texts in terms of the composition of the Pentateuch. And then a very interesting and provocative article on the role of Moses in the composition of the Pentateuch. This last one, we have decided to just combine that with the introduction. So this was earlier. And then we have an epilogue written by Daniel Block and Gary Rinsberg, Christian and a Jewish scholar, how the two of them together, co-writing this article, write about faith commitment and critical analysis of the Pentateuch. It's an interesting piece. And then at the end, Gary Rinsberg pointed out that David J.A. Kleins wrote a fascinating little essay, New Directions in Pooh Studies. Remember, I mentioned Winnie the Pooh, and David J.A. Kleins took that and he tried to apply to it some of the methods that the critical scholars apply to the Pentateuch, but he's applying it to the story of Winnie the Pooh to see how it's going to come out. So it's a parody, which is rather humorous. Then we have indexes of authors and sources and so on and so forth. So that's the tentative table of contents. We're almost done with this. And that shows you the different things that I've been talking about.
Wow, I don't know what to say. I know many of them. Ben Kilgore, we had, I think, 2 or 3 interviews. Also, Richard Auerbach, and soon it will. Aaron Hornkohl will come also to my channel. So many great minds. I love them. Yeah.
Yeah, Averbeck is a wonderful scholar and a really good friend of mine. He's a great guy. He's written another book on biblical law. So the two of us have written books on biblical law. Yeah.
Yes, great. So,
question
yeah.
was Leviticus. Why study Leviticus? Well, first of all, I didn't always like Leviticus. In fact, I badly disliked it. My embarrassing story is that when I was an undergraduate theology major at Pacific Union College, it's a Seventh-day Adventist college in California, there was a course that was quite a good course on the sanctuary and its rituals. Okay. And I didn't even bother to take the class because I was so uninterested in it. The embarrassing thing is that the teacher of the class was my father. I didn't bother to take my father's course. I wasn't interested in the structure of the sanctuary and all that blood and gore and guts and stuff, the caudate lobe on the liver and all that. Oh, I was turned off. I was a major in theology and a double major in music. I was doing a degree in music, and I liked beauty. Okay, I was interested in aesthetics, and I found Leviticus very unbeautiful. And but then when I got done with college, I didn't feel called to be a pastor the way a lot of my fellow theology students went that route. But I wanted to go on to do further studies, especially Hebrew. I wanted to study Hebrew because I was interested in prophecy. And I was interested in also composing music to put the Psalms to music for congregational singing. And I wanted to know the Hebrew so that I could make simpler translations that have meter-like poetry that are easier to set to music and easier to sing. Because when you look at the translation of the Psalms in English, it's very hard to put them to music. So that's the 2 reasons I wanted to study Hebrew. I went down to Berkeley in California, and I started studying Hebrew there. I discovered there that the Hebrew Bible teacher there, and I started off studying modern and rabbinic Hebrew and some biblical Hebrew, but the Hebrew Bible teacher, I learned that his specialty was Leviticus. Oh, and I was so disappointed, Leviticus. But I thought, at least if I study Leviticus with him and other things, then I can at least learn Hebrew and I can do what I want to do with it, right? So he was in the process of writing the JPS Torah commentary on Numbers. And then, which he finished while we were in class with him. And then I was in seminars with him while he was working on the Anchor Bible commentary on Leviticus, which turned out to be the greatest work on Leviticus in history. 3 huge volumes. The first volume he was getting in while I was a student there was almost 1,200 pages. Okay, and he's working on that. So it took him literally a decade, about 10 years, in that seminar to go through Leviticus. And one class period in his home, we spent 2.5 hours discussing not a Hebrew chapter or verse or phrase or clause or word, but one Hebrew letter, a preposition bet in Leviticus 17:11. And we didn't resolve the issue. Okay. Now that's the extreme, but we were going very slowly through, looking at all the range of the textual witnesses, the ancient ones, through the Second Temple period into the rabbinics, and then the modern commentators, and our group could handle a lot of different languages. I ended up studying about 17 languages by the time I got done, as well as looking at ancient Near Eastern parallels. So it was a slow process, but we really got into it. And what often happened was, well, a number of times it happened was that we would get to a point where there was a question about the text, a problem that we didn't understand. And we would sit there musing on it. And Milgrom he wasn't so lively like I am. He would just sit there with his kippah on, because we're studying a sacred text. And he would let us think. There'd be long pauses. And we would have gone all through the whole range of scholarly literature. It took a while, with about 8 to 12 students in the class, generally less than 12. And we would have gone through all of this, and we still hadn't found someone that gave the answer to this problem. And then Milgrom would just show, comparing scripture with scripture, all right, showing how this illuminates this if we look at this other passage. And there was the answer. And here we are, sitting around this table where Jews, Catholics, Lutherans, there was Mormon, Seventh-day Adventist, me, from all over different faith traditions, and we could all come to agree by just letting scripture interpret itself in the details. Now, I got so excited about that, and being Christian, I understood from what the New Testament says about the Old Testament that Leviticus is about it's a type, it's symbols of the temple in heaven, about Christ's future ministry as a sacrifice, as a priest. And I knew this because I'd studied this, okay, in my theology training. And wow, I could see Jesus on Leviticus in type on every page. Now, my teacher didn't necessarily see that because he's a rabbi, okay? But I got so excited because I saw a whole system of interconnected truth, that underneath all the ugliness, all the blood and gore, is beauty of the character of God, showing his love for us. Because in that event on the cross, Jesus demonstrated it was the ugliest event in the history of the universe. Created beings torturing and killing their creator. It was also the most beautiful event in the history of the universe. God displaying his infinite love. And I could see how they come together. And the system of truth, so I could learn about different characteristics and aspects of Christ's sacrifice that I would have otherwise missed by studying Leviticus. And then we're getting into the laws, which were enriching as well. So I would drive home after that class in my 62 Ford Falcon, a car that I'd salvaged, driving home an hour and a half from Berkeley to back where I live with my young wife, my bride, at Pacific Union College, through the Napa Valley area, up in that area. And I would be banging on the steering wheel and shouting because I was so excited about what I was learning about Leviticus. And Milgrom got me hooked on Leviticus. And I got hijacked from what I was planning to do into Leviticus. So my PhD dissertation was on ritual dynamic structure. It was looking at comparing the Israelite Day of Atonement with ancient Near Eastern ritual complexes dealing with purifying temples on particular holy days in Mesopotamia and in the Hittite culture in Anatolia. So then I've written other books, and that's been my focus is the ritual system, and then law. I've written Old Testament law for Christians, but I still have, and I'm still very interested in prophecy, and I've studied especially the book of Daniel, and I've written on Isaiah, I've taught on Isaiah, and so on, and I'm still interested in putting Psalms to music. I've done a little bit of this, and I've found out how to do it. The way to do it is just set the Hebrew text to music, because the Hebrew text of Psalms has meter. You know, so many accents, 3, 2, or 3, 4, or whatever. It has a pattern of accents, and you can easily set it to music. And so I set the Hebrew to music, and then I make an English translation that fits the music, and that works. So anyway, but what I've discovered is that's my journey. Because I was so interested in Leviticus, when we had our young daughter, she was about 7 or 8, we decided to read through the whole Bible in family worship. We read through Genesis, we read through Exodus. We started into Leviticus just a little bit about the slaughter of animals. And at that point, my young daughter, Sarah, her dream in life was to be an animal rights activist. She wanted to save animals, like saving wolves and things like that. And we got into killing animals in Leviticus. Dead stuff. Can't read anymore. Now, she understands it and appreciates it now. She's 32 or so, has 2 little children. But at that point, she was not prepared to read Leviticus because on the surface, it's ugly. It doesn't work. And yet, underneath the theological message is about Jesus, his sacrifice, and God's character, including the character of love. Leviticus 19:18, that's love your neighbor as yourself. That's in Leviticus. The law about lying, not telling falsehoods against your neighbor, is in Leviticus 19:11. There's a lot of beautiful stuff in Leviticus. And so I recommend it. That's the way I start off my Leviticus commentary for the NIV application series, pointing out how unlovely it seemed to be. And yet, even there was a rather well-known preacher who started a church that really grew here. I think it was in Michigan, north of where I am. Bell, I think is his last name. I'm trying to remember his name. Anyway, I refer to him at the beginning of my Leviticus volume. He started planning a church to a whole group of people, interdenominational, and he decided if God is behind this, he can even use the book of Leviticus. So he started preaching like for a whole year on Leviticus. And the idea was a test because the book of Leviticus is the most apparently unappealing book. And yet, if God can use that to raise up a group of people to love God, then that must mean God is really behind it. And it worked. It really worked. So anyway, that was just a little story.
All right, a beautiful message and story, Professor Gane. So that was an enlightening and nuanced discussion with our Dr. Gane on the dating and structure of Leviticus and Numbers. Dear audience, if you enjoyed this conversation, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more interviews on the intersection of biblical scholarship and theology. Until next time, goodbye.